a royal heir with a tarnished reputation. A killer who stalked London's darkest streets, vanishing without a trace. And a theory so sensational it still sends a chill down the spine more than a century later. Could Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria and second in line to the British throne, have been the real Jack the Ripper? Today on Hannah's Royal Mysteries, we peel back the fog of Victorian London to explore one of the most chilling and controversial theories in royal history. Welcome back to Hannah's Royal Mysteries, the place where regal glamour meets murder, scandal and intrigue. I'm Hannah, and if you're fascinated by the dark hidden corners of royal history, you're in the right place. Today's story plunges us into the blood-soaked streets of 1888 Whitechapel, where fear ruled and death wore a shadowy face. Jack the Ripper, a name that evokes terror even now. A phantom killer who struck with brutal precision, who mocked the police and left a legacy of fear that still grips the public imagination. But what if the man behind the knife wasn't a shadowy figure from the slums, but a prince, born into privilege, wealth, and destined for the throne? It's a claim that seems almost too sensational to believe, and yet over the decades, whispers have persisted. Today we dive deep into the evidence, the theories, and the tragic life of Prince Albert Victor to find out if there's any truth to this royal horror story. Let's begin at the very heart of it. Who was Prince Albert Victor? Before we can even entertain the possibility that a future king could have been one of history's most notorious killers, we need to understand who Prince Albert Victor was. He was born on the 8th of January 1864. Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward, known simply as Eddie to his family, was the eldest son of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, and the grandson of Queen Victoria. As the firstborn son of the heir apparent, he was second in line to the throne, expected to eventually rule the vast British Empire. But from the very beginning, it was clear that Eddie was different. Contemporary accounts describe him as a sweet-natured but somewhat dim and delicate child. His tutors, including the famous intellectual J.R. Seeley, struggled to educate him, often reporting that he lacked intellectual curiosity and had difficulty concentrating. There were frequent rumours, although important to note never officially confirmed, that Eddie was developmentally delayed or suffered from learning difficulties, which at the time would have been euphemistically described as delicate health or mental sluggishness. Despite efforts to improve his education, including a stint at Cambridge and even military training, Eddie remained more of a figurehead than a future leader. His lack of political acumen worried many within the establishment. Queen Victoria herself described him as a dear boy, but not bright. Yet in other ways, Eddie conformed perfectly to the image of a Victorian royal prince. He was charming, handsome, and carried himself with a gentle dignity. Tall and elegant, he made a favourable impression at public appearances, even if behind closed doors he was considered ill-suited for the heavy responsibilities that awaited him. But it wasn't just his intellectual shortcomings that raised eyebrows. Prince Eddie was a magnet for scandal. Whispers of scandal, rumours of Eddie's personal life dogged him throughout his short existence. The most persistent stories revolved around his sexuality. Some accounts linked him to the notorious Cleveland Street Scandal of 1889, in which a male brothel catering to aristocrats and politicians was uncovered. The Cleveland Street brothel obviously no longer stands, but at the time it only catered to the wealthiest men in Victorian society. It was known for its discretion. But if that's the case, how did the scandal break? The scandal broke when a telegraph messenger boy was found with multiple weeks' wages in his pocket. He was initially accused of gaining the money through theft, and when he was questioned, he said that he had earned it through sleeping with men at Cleveland Street. Although there is no evidence that Prince Eddie ever visited the brothel, it is alleged that his name is brought into the mix by a solicitor. Lord Arthur Somerset was the person who was really being investigated, and it was thought that if they brought the prince's name into the mix, he was more likely to get off the charges. It would be so scandalous that it couldn't be made public, and therefore Arthur couldn't be tried. Eddie was never named, but one paper implied his involvement, and for the general public, that was enough. Although Prince Eddie's direct involvement was never proven, and contemporary documents suggest he was likely innocent, the mere association with such a scandal was damaging enough. In Victorian Britain, where public morality was a facade barely masking private indulgence, even unproven allegations could tarnish a reputation irreparably. In Eddie's case, the rumours fuelled the perception of a wayward prince who was weak, naive, and possibly compromised. Then there were whispers of mental instability. Some later writers speculated that Eddie may have suffered from a form of inherited sanity, an idea fed by sensationalist journalism, but with little hard evidence. Still, the combination of perceived intellectual dullness, potential moral lapses, and emotional fragility made Eddie a prime candidate for darker theories in the decades that followed. Being second in line to the throne carried enormous weight. Victorian Britain was a world power at its height, and the monarchy was a symbol of national pride. Every aspect of a royal's life was scrutinised. Every misstep could bring disgrace. For Eddie, this pressure was exasperated by his perceived inadequacies. Courtiers fretted about how he would rule. Newspapers speculated about his suitability for marriage. Behind palace walls, there was an urgent campaign to find him a wife who could shore up his reputation and steady the monarchy's future. In 1891, a solution appeared. Princess Mary of Teck, a poised and well-connected young woman, was selected as his bride. Their engagement was announced with great fanfare. But before the wedding could take place, fate intervened. In early 1892, Eddie fell ill with influenza, part of a global pandemic sweeping Europe. His health deteriorated rapidly, and on the 14th of January 1892, just days after his 28th birthday, Prince Albert Victor died at Sandringham House. The sudden death shocked the nation. Mourning bells tolled across Britain. Queen Victoria was devastated. Princess Mary, left bereaved, would later marry Eddie's younger brother, who became King George V. To many, Prince Eddie's death seemed like a tragic end to an unremarkable life. But for conspiracy theorists, it was just the beginning. Because when a series of horrific murders gripped London in 1888, murders that would later be attributed to the shadowy figure known as Jack the Ripper, some would look back at Prince Albert Victor's troubled life and wonder, was there more to it? Was the kindly but troubled prince hiding a far more sinister secret? The question on everybody's lips was Prince Albert Victor Jack the Ripper? By the summer of 1888, London was a city divided. On one side, the glittering splendour of Victorian elite, balls, banquets, horse-drawn carriages parading down polished streets. On the other, the teeming, desperate masses packed into the East End. Whitechapel was a place where poverty oozed from every crumbling brick. Overcrowded tenements, choking factory smoke, and labyrinth alleys created a world that was virtually invisible to polite society. It was here that the Ripper struck, a place where lives were cheap and death was common. Between August and November 1888, 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were savagely murdered. Each killing escalated in brutality. Throats slashed, bodies mutilated, internal organs removed with almost surgical precision. The crimes were not just murders, they were spectacles. The press, newly emboldened by mass printing, reported every gruesome detail. Fear gripped London. Whispers filled the smoky pubs. Was the killer a butcher, a doctor, a madman, or someone far, far more powerful? And from the start, the Ripper case wasn't just about murder. It exposed deep anxieties about class, gender, immigration, and the very fabric of the empire itself. Into this boiling cauldron of fear stepped the rumours about Prince Albert Victor. So how did Eddie's name get entangled with Jack the Ripper? Well, it's important to understand that during his lifetime, Eddie was never officially linked to the Ripper's murders. His name only surfaced decades later, largely due to a mix of conspiracy theories, fictionalised accounts, and historical revisionism. The first serious link between Eddie and the Ripper crimes appeared in the 1960s and 70s. That's mad. That is literally like 80, 90 years after the actual murders happened. That's ridiculous. Writers like Stephen Knight popularised the theory that the murders were part of a royal cover-up, an attempt to silence prostitutes who knew too much about a scandal involving Prince Albert Victor. According to this theory, Eddie had secretly married a Catholic woman named Annie Crook, had a child with her, and when prostitutes in Whitechapel discovered this explosive little secret, they were systematically eliminated by agents of the Crown. In this version, Eddie was either directly involved in the killings or implicated through guilt and necessity. There are, however, enormous problems with this theory. First, historical records show Eddie was not in London during some of the murders. He was actually at Balmoral Castle in Scotland with Queen Victoria during critical dates in the timeline. Travel was arduous. It wasn't just a simple matter to slip away undetected. Second, Eddie's health and demeanour don't match the brutal profile of the Ripper. While not the brightest royal by all accounts, he was gentle, mild-mannered and passive. Hardly the type to commit sadistic mutilations in back alleys. And third, the idea of a massive royal conspiracy involving multiple assassins, police cover-ups and witnesses sworn to silence seems a bit far-fetched, especially when you consider how often royal secrets leaked to the press in that era. Still, the theory persists. Why? Because it's a powerful narrative that beneath the glittering surface of empire, monstrous crimes could fester, protected by wealth, privilege, and ruthless secrecy. It's also worth considering that the London Metropolitan Police of 1888 were overwhelmed and underprepared for the Ripper case. Forensics as we know it today just didn't exist. Crime scenes were contaminated by gawkers, reporters, even rival police officers from overlapping jurisdictions. Descriptions of the suspects varied wildly, from a well-dressed gentleman carrying a medical bag to a scruffy foreigner hiding in the shadows. Amidst this chaos, it's easy to see how conspiracy theories took root. When there's no clear culprit, the imagination fills the void. And who better to suspect than a privileged royal, shielded from investigation, whose own life story was already marked by rumour and scandal. It's critical to mention that serious historical research has repeatedly exonerated Prince Eddie from being Jack the Ripper. Official records, royal diaries, and travel logs show that during key murders, Eddie was far away from Whitechapel. Some researchers, like Dr. Thomas Stowell, and later historians have tried to argue he might have had a secret double life or that records were forged, but the evidence just simply doesn't hold up. Moreover, Eddie's physical and mental state, described by his contemporaries as lethargic, uninterested, and often sickly, hardly fits the profile of a nimble killer capable of slipping away unseen after committing horrific crimes in narrow alleyways. As for the notion that he had syphilis-induced madness, another popular Ripper-related claim, medical records at the time show no indication that Eddie suffered from syphilis, and certainly not the late-stage neurological symptoms associated with violent psychosis. So, where did the myth come from? Well, in a word, fear. Victorian society had an uneasy relationship with its own upper class. As much as the monarchy was revered, there was a growing awareness of its isolation, its decadence, and its alienation from the common people. Jack the Ripper wasn't just a murderer. He was a mirror, a reflection of the anxieties, inequalities, and hidden darknesses of the era. Linking him to a royal wasn't just thrilling, it was cathartic. It allowed ordinary people to believe that the rich and powerful were just as corrupt and just as vulnerable as they were. And Prince Albert Victor, with his troubled reputation, his perceived weakness, and his tragic early death, was a perfect vessel for these fears. For all of its allure, the theory that Prince Albert Victor was Jack the Ripper simply just doesn't stand on its own. When we move past the sensational headlines and into the documented facts, a much clearer and much less thrilling picture emerges. First, the timeline. One of the most damning blows to the theory is Prince Eddie's proven whereabouts during key moments of the Ripper murders. Royal archives, military records, and personal correspondence show that he just wasn't even in London when at least 3 of the canonical 5 murders occurred. In late August 1888, for example, when Mary Ann Nichols, the Ripper's first widely recognised victim, was killed, Eddie was staying at Yorkshire, home of the Lord and Lady Lunsborough. Eyewitness accounts, newspaper mentions, and household guest books confirm his presence there. Similarly, during the brutal double murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the night of the 30th of September, Eddie was attending official engagements at Balmoral in Scotland, hundreds of miles away from the blood-soaked alleys of Whitechapel. While Victorian trains were fast for their time, they weren't fast enough to make such a journey overnight without anyone noticing, especially for a man whose movements were almost certainly documented by staff, courtiers, and the press. Second, the personality profile. Modern criminology has given us insights into the psychological makeup of serial killers like Jack the Ripper. They tend to be highly organised, manipulative, and emotionally detached, often displaying early signs of violence or cruelty. Prince Eddie, by all contemporary accounts, was none of these things. He was described as gentle, passive, and even painfully shy. Far from being a secret sadist, he was, if anything, too emotionally vulnerable, a man who needed constant guidance and supervision, not someone capable of orchestrating a brutal killing spree under the cover of darkness. Third, medical and cognitive ability. The Ripper's killings, gruesome as they were, showed a level of anatomical knowledge. The careful removal of organs, the precision of certain cuts, suggesting either a butcher, surgeon, or someone with a practical understanding of human anatomy. Prince Eddie, who struggled academically, even with private tutors, was unlikely to have had the dexterity or the scientific knowledge required to perform such acts. And finally, there's the matter of motive. Serial killers are often driven by deeply personal compulsions, anger, revenge, psychosexual dysfunction. But there's no evidence that Eddie harboured such violent impulses. He had no known hatred of women, no public or private history of cruelty. If anything, his scandals revolved around indiscretions of the heart, not outbursts of violence. So why did this theory stick around? Part of it has to do with the very nature of conspiracy theories. They thrive on gaps in records, in knowledge, and in common sense. When people feel powerless in the face of chaos, as Victorians did during the Ripper's reign of terror, they often look for answers that feel big enough to match the scale of their fear. And what could be bigger than implicating royalty itself? Moreover, the British monarchy, even today, represents a complex cocktail of reverence and suspicion. We admire the pageantry, but we also half expect that behind the velvet curtains lurk terrible secrets. The notion that a future king could be a hidden monster taps into our oldest fears about power and corruption. In the end, the theory that Prince Albert Victor was Jack the Ripper tells us more about Victorian anxieties, about class, about control, about the fragile line between civilization and savagery, than it does about the real identity of the killer. The true Jack the Ripper remains elusive, lost to history. But Prince Eddie, though a tragic figure, almost certainly was not him. So if Prince Albert Victor wasn't Jack the Ripper, who was? If the royal scapegoat can be ruled out by hard evidence and cold logic, then we are left facing a much bigger and perhaps even more chilling question. Who truly haunted the streets of Whitechapel during those bloody months of 1888? Even after discounting Prince Albert Victor as a suspect, we're still left with an unnerving roster of possible culprits, each more unsettling than the last. At the top of many lists is Montague John Druitt, a barrister and part-time schoolteacher from a respectable middle-class family. Druitt's suicide in the Thames in December 1888, just weeks after the last canonical murder, raised suspicions. Police officials at the time privately hinted that the killings had stopped because the killer was dead. Druitt's background, however, cast doubt. He had no medical training, no criminal record, and no clear connection to Whitechapel. Yet his sudden death, coinciding so neatly with the end of the murders, continues to fuel speculation. Then there's Aaron Kamiński, a Polish Jewish immigrant and a barber by trade, who lived in the heart of Whitechapel. Kamiński suffered with severe mental illness, documented in asylum records, auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and violent outbursts. Importantly, he harboured a deep-seated hatred of women, particularly prostitutes, aligning with modern profiles of serial killers. Kamiński was under police surveillance, and some senior officers, including Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson, later wrote that the Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew, possibly alluding to Kamiński. However, contemporaneous evidence to directly tie him to the crimes is frustratingly absent, and DNA matches suggested by modern tests have been hotly contested for issues of contamination. Another figure often discussed is Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born con man and thief with a long criminal history. The Macnaghten Memorandum, written by police in 1894, lists Ostrog as a suspect, yet there's no clear proof he was even in London at the time of the murders. His crimes, while varied, did not suggest a predilection for violence or sadistic behaviour. And then there is Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, the so-called Lambeth prisoner. Cream was a trained doctor who killed women by poisoning them. His knowledge of anatomy fits the medical theory, but there is a major hitch. During the Ripper murders, he was incarcerated in a prison in Illinois. Some conspiracists argue he bribed his way out early, but official records indicate otherwise. Complicating matters even further are the limitations of Victorian police work. Fingerprinting wasn't yet in use, DNA analysis was more than a century away, and crime scenes were just not properly secured. In fact, much of the evidence we now take for granted, like fibres, blood splatter analysis, and even accurate autopsy reporting, was either mishandled or non-existent. Witness statements were conflicting, tainted by alcohol, fear, and the dim gaslit streets of Whitechapel. Moreover, public pressure created an impossible environment for investigators. The newspapers whipped up panic and false leads flooded Scotland Yard. Every immigrant, every vagabond, every eccentric character became a target of suspicion. The idea of savage beasts lurking in London slums fed both the xenophobia and social fears about the underbelly of the industrial city. Despite all of these obstacles, some modern criminologists argue that Jack the Ripper was most likely a local man, someone who blended easily into Whitechapel life, who knew the alleys intimately and who had a personal hatred of the women he slaughtered. Someone whose life may have ended shortly after the murders, explaining why they suddenly stopped. Was it Druitt, plagued by mental breakdown and shame? Was it Kaminsky, battling inner demons and violent impulses? Was it someone else entirely? A man whose name we will never know, who slipped into the fog and shadows of history? What remains certain is the legend of Jack the Ripper endures, not because we know his identity, but precisely because we don't. The unsolved nature of the case allows every generation to project its own fears onto what is essentially a faceless killer. And as we've seen, even royalty, like Prince Eddie, were not immune from being swept into the dark myth. Thank you for joining me today on my journey through Victorian shadows and royal scandals. Whether Prince Albert Victor was a tragic figure caught in a storm of conspiracy, or simply a convenient scapegoat, the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. And maybe that's the point. The unknown keeps the story alive, whispering through dark alleys of our imagination. If you enjoyed this deep dive, then don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and join me, Hannah, next time on Hannah's Royal Mysteries. But until then, keep your wits sharp and your secrets hidden.